Linux Luddites, episode 62, for the 15th of November, 2015. Hello and welcome to Linux Luddites, the show where we try all the latest free and open source software and then decide that we like the old stuff better. I'm Joe.
I'm Jesse.
And I'm Paddy. And with us all safely returned home from OggCamp, this show will be getting back on track with our regular programming. So today that means a look through what's been happening in the free and open source world over the last couple of weeks. Plus, with OggCamp still fresh in our minds, settling down over a pint to discuss what makes the perfect FOSS event. But before we get into the show proper, I heard you two got together again with some listeners earlier this week.
Yes, on Thursday evening we went to the Mulberry Bush pub, again near Waterloo, and had a great time. There were various other podcasting people and various other Linux people and some listeners, and had a really good time. Had quite a few drinks and can vaguely remember it, I think.
Yeah, it was nice to catch up with Scott again, who was the sort of the reason for doing it, if you will, and then Popey came along and Wimpy and, like I say, some other...
luminaries?
Other luminaries and a whole bunch of listeners. So it was good to meet everyone and a few faces from last time. So hopefully we'll be able to do that again soon.
And was it an opportunity to save on postage costs?
Yeah, we gave out quite a few stickers, so that was good. And I realised that last time when I was on my own doing the kind of intro, I was a little bit vague and ambiguous about the stickers situation. So to clarify that, if you have ever supported us before, then you can have some stickers and we will pay for the postage, but you need to give us your address in order to do that. So it's not just going to automatically happen because we don't get your address from PayPal or whatever. So if you want stickers, email us your address and put stickers in the subject to show@linuxluddites.com and I'll get them sent out to you.
And there's a bit more than stickers available now, isn't there?
Yeah, we've got all sorts. We've got t-shirts, hoodies, we've got a mug, we've got a lanyard, all coming from Spreadshirt. So if you're interested in any of that, go to linuxluddites.com/shop.
Yeah, the benefit of using Spreadshirt is that they do all the printing and will send out to you, deal with the address and the payments and everything. So we've put our highest quality images up there and we trust in them to be able to, make the quality that we're expecting. So I'm certainly going to buy myself one. You can also pick colours and things. We've suggested obviously blacks and whites, but if you fancy a t-shirt with a LL on it and our classic phrase, then head over there and pick a colour for t-shirts and jumpers and things. So with all of our promotions and bits and bobs out the way, shall we get on with the news?
Yeah, let's do it. So to start with then, pretty much doom and gloom when it comes to privacy on the internet, especially if you live in the UK.
Yeah, referring, of course, to our glorious Home Secretary's announcement and the details that are starting to come out whilst we're actually out at OggCamp recently.
Yeah, so now your web browsing history is going to be stored for a year, something which I had assumed was happening anyway, but now it's mandated.
Yeah, well, let me interrupt you there. I mean, you say you suspect it was happening anyway. I mean, it was happening anyway in a lot of cases. I mean, some of the information that's come out since is the fact that they've been using the 1984 Telecommunications Act to actually force companies to do this and just not told anybody about it.
Well, the Tinfoil Hat Brigade have been going on about this for years, and that's kind of why I'd always assumed it's a relatively straightforward thing to do, to monitor and record everyone's communications. And in the wake of the Snowden revelations, it seems to have almost got worse insofar as now they are putting laws in place to make it legal, whereas before it was always been a bit shady and not documented. Now they're just kind of being really brazen about it and saying, yes, we're going to do it, and here's a law that allows us to do it.
Yeah, I've got to say that was my take as well. I mean, they seem to be making quite a lot of fuss, various privacy campaigners, about this, but as we've both said, they have been doing this for a while, and really all they are doing is publicly admitting to it and actually enshrining it in a publicly viewable law. Clearly, there's been a whole lot of blowback about this in the press, but there's also been a great charm offensive going on, and it amused me quite highly to read an article in The Guardian from a guy who supposedly works at GCHQ saying how vital it all was for national security.
That was a pretty funny piece, wasn't it? Just, honest, we're not doing anything wrong, and it's all for your own good. And by the way, I'm completely anonymous, and this could just be written by anyone. It makes you wonder, does anyone read that stuff and take it seriously? I really hope not.
You do look at all these articles and kind of think the bottom line is always, it's this, terrorism. It's always the answer, isn't it? Because while apparently these laws and legislations won't ban encryption, they're saying that they're not going to prevent people from using it. They also say that ISPs and things should provide the information in an unencrypted form. So how are you going to get from encrypted to unencrypted? How the ISP is going to do that if everyone's using it? So I wouldn't be surprised if something comes out which, the whole discussion about backdoors in encryption and whether the government can have their own method of encryption which they can look at, it starts to get worrying if this is stage one of not only getting our information but preventing us from encrypting it as well.
Well, that was something I found really striking in all the reporting I've seen about this. They aren't asking for anything to deal with VPNs or Tor, and that kind of rings some alarm bells for me.
What, you think that Tor isn't all it's cracked up to be, then?
Well, we know it's not, even from what's been publicly put out there. I mean, we've seen recently about the Carnegie Mellon researchers being able to de-anonymise people. But the fact it's not called out and they are trying to get a clean sweep across the board otherwise does seem rather suspicious.
Yeah, I see what you mean. If it was a threat, they would have done something to reduce it from being a threat. But if they see it as, oh, well, we can do that already, 100%, no need to actually spell it out in the laws and legislations. Yeah, I hadn't thought about that.
But anyway, this doesn't just have privacy implications. There's also a large financial burden going to be put upon us taxpayers.
Yeah, asked how much it would cost. They estimated it at about $250 million, which sounds like fairly good value for money if you're looking at it from a purely financial point of view, because there's a lot of infrastructure needed, there's a lot of people needed. It seems like a fairly cheap thing to implement. However, some people have actually looked at the numbers and done some analytics on it and reckon it's more like $2 billion. So that's only an 8-fold increase on their estimate. So I think they've very much overlooked some of the costs which they'll incur to do this.
The argument, of course, is there's no price too high to put on national security. And I think it's fair to point out we're recording this on the afternoon of November the 14th, following the events in Paris last night. And that's only going to play into things like this, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. The discussion on we need to do this because terrorism, people in power will now say, look, this is what will happen. We didn't have enough powers. We should have more. We should be able to see everything. We should ban encryption and we will prevent it. And I don't know, I just sort of think that while their arguments do make some sense because they want to see it all in order to block terrorism and, stop terrorism, all these sorts of things, but they're not going to stop terrorism. There are far bigger things that are happening, which is the reason terrorism's happening and it's coming to our shores. And those are the ways in which you prevent it, not looking at what your people in your home countries are doing. And this is what got me about this legislation as well, is that they think they're going to be able to use it on other countries as well, outside of the UK. I don't see how, if, France said, right, England must give us all their information on these users and what have you, you'd expect there to be, okay, there may be treaties in the way that allow us to do it because we're friends, but if there's a country which you're not friends with and they demand information, you wouldn't expect us to give out that information. I also don't expect any country in the world that we ask to give us information to do so. I don't understand how you can put that law in on other countries, so I don't quite see how that's going to work. I think that's a bit of a fuzzy grey area, which is optimistic from their point of view, as far as I can see.
Well, the great irony of all this, as far as I can see, is that the only way to combat terrorism is through education and to enlighten people. And the tools that the governments are looking to ban are crucial for education. You need to have this technology and encryption and stuff to be able to have the internet working properly. And the internet is such a great tool for education and enlightenment. And So they're just going about it completely in the wrong way, and in a quite ironic way, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, the purpose of this legislation is to increase the size of the haystack, fundamentally, isn't it? It's to capture all of our data. And invariably, it isn't the size of the haystack that's the problem. It's the fact that people can't keep track of the needles. And I can guarantee, I mean, things from Paris aren't at all clear at the moment. But in the next week or two, as things shake out, we will hear the phrase, they were known to the security services in all the reporting. And that is always the case. And it's not the lack of intelligence pointing at individuals that's the problem. It's that the security services don't have the resources to adequately then follow up on that and keep track of people.
Yeah, I guess there's a bit of a view that if you can collect all the data, you can do number crunch on it with algorithms and programs, and who needs the people, the resources, like you say, to actually then follow it up hasn't maybe been thought out so well. Or there's going to be a real push to recruit more people to MI5 and GCHQ, places like that. But put all that behind us, let's move on to more specific Linux news. And this is that Ubuntu in 1604, their LTS, is going to remove the software center. So the Ubuntu Software Center, I'm sure everyone's familiar with it. It's received a certain amount of negative press. It's fairly old, it's fairly slow, and they've sort of stepped back and had a look at what is out there that could incorporate what the Software Center currently does, but also incorporate their move towards click packages and things like this. And it looks like they've decided that actually moving the Software Center to where they want it to be is going to be more problematic than just incorporating the GNOME Software Center. So that is what will be in 1604.
Yeah, and that's not the only bit of the GNOME stack they're planning on dragging over, is it?
Absolutely. They're also bringing in GNOME Calendar. I was about to say I don't really know what the Ubuntu Unity calendar is like, but now I think about it, it's just up here in the top right hand corner, so we'll have a quick look. And it's a fairly basic calendar, and apparently the GNOME calendar has a lot more functionality, is a lot more modern and elegant, and I think it incorporates sort of Google Calendar and things like this, so they're going to bring that in as well. And at the same time, not replacing, they're just full on dropping a couple of applications, Brasero, the CD, DVD burning application, and Empathy, the instant messenger application, basically because they're not being maintained. And while you could argue that if Brasero works, it does a very simple job and you could leave it in there, I think this is just showing the move away from PCs and laptops that actually have physical media.
I don't run Unity at all, so the question for you is how well these applications will actually integrate. I mean, does it support client-side decorations properly?
Well, I have to say, I'm getting myself confused because I know GNOME is coming out with a lot of very specific window decorations and things, and I forget who forces it upon whom. I know, for example, my Chrome instance will change to look like the Chrome browser wants to, rather than the way Unity wants it to look. So they must be able to support the client-side decorations. And when it comes to the notification area, which is where I assume the calendar will sit, that obviously will be decorated to be within the Unity color palette.
All right.
I mean, there's always a big fuss when things get dropped from the default image, but is it a really big deal if they're still in the repo and they're just an app getaway or a GNOME Software Center click away? I mean, who really has an optical drive in their machine anymore? I mean, apart from you, Jesse, I've got two machines in front of me. Paddy, your laptop doesn't have one. No one really has one anymore. So why do you even need Brasero? But if you do need it, it's simple to install. So I don't really see the big fuss, really.
Now, I guess the argument would be that Ubuntu specifically is aimed at newcomers, and it's nice to have everything there out of the box, so people are aware it's there. That perhaps they're not particularly au fait with the fact that there is a software center, no matter whose software center it might be, in the distro, and how to actually get hold of additional software.
Yeah, I suppose so, but you can't have every little bit of software, especially stuff that is essentially obsolete. I mean, optical media is obsolete now, isn't it?
I don't think it is really. It's still a great backup medium.
Is it? It's a terrible backup medium. You get errors when you try and burn things more often than not, and if it's sitting on your shelf, then over time, CDs and DVDs just rot away and don't work anymore. I mean, I've got DVD backups from years ago that are really sketchy and don't work now. So I would say that it's a terrible backup medium.
Well, you say that, but there are huge variations between CDs and DVDs and read-only and read-write medias. And I can remember there was a study done by NIST for the Library of Congress about this, and that's probably the best known one. I'll try and dig out a link and put it in the show notes for people if they're interested.
Okay, well, maybe I went wrong by buying the cheapest possible DVDs that I could from eBay, and that's why they went wrong after a few years. But let's drag it back on topic anyway, and talk about how they're going to drop the Python 2.x branch as well from Ubuntu 16.04. So it's going to be Python 3 only.
Yeah, so in the 16.04 release, they will only have Python 3.5, and this is part of the, as far as I can see, decade-long move from Python 2.x to Python 3, which everyone says is the right way of doing it and allowing people time to implement Python 3, and this is apparently Ubuntu's time. And it just means that you end up with one version of Python and you don't have to maintain the old code and allow yourself a potential surface for attack. So minimizing the amount of effort to maintain one thing rather than two.
So this seems like quite a lot of changes for a long-term support release.
Yeah, I'm really surprised by the Software Center because that's quite a big move. It's quite a big thing to have changed, and to drop it straight in a LTS, you'd expect there to have been some sort of tinkering and error finding by having it in a non-LTS. But then again, I suppose if that's the way it's going to be in the future, and the LTSs are supported for 2 years, is it?
No, 5 years.
5 years. So in that time, they want to be well and truly on the path to click packages and things like this. And if the Software Center, the Ubuntu Software Center, doesn't support it, then it's going to have to be that way.
But why? We've been talking about how boring every release has been, and we've basically not covered the releases because there's nothing to say about them. Since 14.04, the subsequent ones have just been real yawners where nothing has really changed. You've had slightly bumped up version numbers of things in the kernel, but there's not been anything exciting and noteworthy. And that is the time to do stuff like this, surely. So it is surprising, as you say, that they're going to drop all of this new stuff and make all these changes in an LTS. And the LTS is just so important to them.
Well, I think maybe you have the benefit of 2 years of hindsight, because the 14.04 release, you think of the amount of movement there's been in their phone efforts, and also the move to click packages, which originally were snaps on the phone, I think, and now they're moving over to clicks, which can do both phone and PC, and that's 2 years worth of movement, which has moved effort and resources away from the desktop, hence why they've been such yawners. But they don't know where they're going to be 2 years after this LTS, and the churn that will have happened. I think sitting here now and saying, look at where they are, you couldn't have sat here 2 years ago. Even Ubuntu couldn't have sat 2 years ago and said that's where we'll be by 16.04. And I think they're just reacting to the way in which they've sort of organically got to this position. So the way I see it is they're sort of just lining this LTS up in the direction they expect to go, and maybe in 2 years' time, for, do my maths, 18.04, they will be in a different position. But at the moment, it's probably their best punt on where they're going to be.
Oh, well, moving it on from our friends at Canonical to our other friends at Red Hat, and to very little fanfare or acclaim or disdain, they've well and truly deep-throated Microsoft.
Well, I think that's a little bit harsh to go that far, but they certainly have partnered up with Microsoft, at least in the server side of things and the cloud. And, it's all too easy to criticize people for making deals with Microsoft, but they just want to make money, don't they? And, could it be that this will make Microsoft support a little bit more open source software? I mean, even if it is open source software that is only to facilitate proprietary software, it's still a good thing that there's more open source software being developed.
Yeah, the idea is that you can have Red Hat running on Microsoft's Azure cloud platform, and they've got some of their actual Red Hat engineers physically sitting in Redmond, so that when problems occur, which aren't within Microsoft's kind of remit of knowledge, they can quickly get the Red Hat engineers to look at it and hopefully answer it or change the code or whatever they need to do, which makes both of them look good, doesn't it? Because Microsoft are serving this up, and the people who think they're dealing with Microsoft are getting a good service, and Red Hat is being used and being run and is also having fixes put out. As you say, Joe, more code, isn't that a better thing? And so just because it's Microsoft, I think there's going to be a negative twist on this. But as you say, they're both out to make money. They will both look good because of this. And if it makes Red Hat look good and more people run it because it's having errors found and improvements made, it should in theory be good for Red Hat. And we all agree that Red Hat is the right sort of company. It's the company we generally tend to think of as having done well out of open source.
Yeah, which kind of brings me back to how I started things, because obviously a little bit harsh on them. But the reaction from the press and the commentariat to this, I found really interesting, and it was either positive or just sort of lukewarm. There was no outright criticism apart from the odd absolute FOSS seller. And that's really interesting, because if you think back to how Novell were treated when they did a deal with Microsoft all those years ago, there was a huge hoo-ha, and everybody got the knickers in a twist about it. It partly informed, was it Section 11 of GPL v3 was written specifically to try and stop that sort of deal happening again. But because this is Red Hat, because they make so much money, because they play so much advertising in magazines, nobody dares speak about it.
Maybe not, because at that time with the Novell deal, that was still in the, Linux is a cancer and all that stuff. Whereas now Microsoft loves Linux. And, that might all just be PR and, spin. But at least that's the public side of things. And, that's the perception that they're going for. And so we are in a different climate now, aren't we?
I would go so far as to say that the change is also Microsoft was the big enemy. And now, Microsoft isn't really that much of a threat. The fact that Linux is used so widely on the server space and for Docker and things like this, Microsoft isn't really a big worry. So I don't think they've got the sort of number one enemy target anymore.
So if we're thinking specifically about Red Hat then and how they benefit, who is their big enemy? Do you think it's Oracle Linux? Do you think it's SUSE? Because neither of those are going to come out of this deal particularly well.
I thought it was Ubuntu, wasn't it? They're the number one on the server space.
Yeah, that's actually a fair point. I think Amazon instances and DigitalOcean droplets and such like, there's a huge amount of Ubuntu out there. But just take it back to the Novell thing we were talking about a minute ago. I mean, when they signed a deal with Microsoft back in 2006, SUSE was part of Novell then. And since that happened, there's actually been a sum of money passed from Microsoft to SUSE every year by way of purchasing licenses. And their agreement runs out at the end of this year. It's only a couple of months' time. I mean, what is going to happen to SUSE as part of this deal if Microsoft just sticks with Red Hat and that goes away?
Well, I think it would be a bad PR move to suddenly start going after SUSE again and breaking the peace there. So I would think that you'd probably just have a quiet deal signed again and, just let them get on with it.
You're talking about the patent side of things there, aren't you?
Yeah.
Yeah, because obviously at the moment Microsoft and SUSE have got a deal on patents, and Red Hat and Microsoft have just signed a deal saying we don't accept each other's patents, we don't accept that Microsoft has any claim on Linux, but we're not going to pursue actions against each other. But it doesn't say anything about pursuing actions against any other Linux company other than Red Hat.
Yeah, but that's what I'm talking about. It would be bad PR for them to do that. I mean, especially with this Microsoft loves Linux business. It's ultimately probably not worth it for them to go after other Linux companies when they can just try and, I suppose, outcompete them by doing deals with Red Hat.
Yeah, I guess what I'm asking is, with Red Hat in bed with them now, and Red Hat having the amount of clout it does in the industry, if they started going after other Linux companies, would we see the bad press about it, or would it be muzzled?
Yeah, I suppose so, but I don't know, with social media and stuff, it would probably come out, albeit not on a huge scale, maybe. So, yeah, maybe you're right. Well, shifting slightly to Fedora, and Fedora 23 has been released. And it's been released on time, almost, for once. And they've tightened up security by dropping some of the old encryption ciphers. But it's still not hugely exciting to me, I'm afraid.
So I guess it's around now that Pete will be updating to Fedora 22.
Yeah, I think he said that he had done that recently, yeah.
I thought it was funny when we were at OggCamp, Dan, who was sat behind the Fedora desk, had a whole bunch of Fedora 22 DVDs. And I was talking to him about the release of 23, and I realised that they were just trying to get rid of the stock of 22s they had.
Yeah.
It is hard to know what it's for, though, isn't it?
Well, especially now they've got CentOS, it becomes a little bit less relevant. But I know there are a lot of people using it. Certainly a lot of our listeners use it. Whenever we bash Fedora, we get a lot of hate mail saying, oh, you're Debian fanboys, Ubuntu fanboys.
Yeah, that we do.
So it clearly appeals to some people.
Yeah, and in some ways I can understand it on the desktop. It's the people that use it on servers and such like that get me, because even if it's interesting to see what the latest stuff is, the fact that you get support for such a short length of time and you're never going to roll it out in production, well, we've actually had listeners saying they do, so I would take that back. I don't know. It just seems sort of a halfway house to me. It's neither totally up to date nor long enough supported to actually be useful.
Yeah, I think you're definitely right in terms of servers, but desktop-wise, it makes more sense for people to use it because they like the RPM way of doing things, even if they've changed Yum to DNF now. And I've seen Pete complaining quite a lot about DNF. But yeah, on servers, and that's kind of what the focus of this 23 release is, isn't it? About the kind of server and cloud stuff. And I suppose if you live in the kind of Red Hat world or CentOS, then testing is really what it's about. You're not going to use it in production, as you said, Paddy, but it is nice to have a slightly more cutting edge distro to test new stuff on. So maybe that's its role, really. Because, if you want to have the real latest, then you would run an Arch server. Whereas this is kind of gives you a little bit more predictability. I would say stability, but I'll probably get hate mail, but a bit more of a solid foundation. But it is more up to date than Red Hat or CentOS.
Yeah, quite a lot more up to date. I think this one's coming with GNOME 3.18, isn't it?
Yeah, and Plasma 5.4 in the KDE side of things. So fairly up to date, yeah. But they seem to be having a few problems on the KDE side of things. Kevin Koffler, who is one of the co-maintainers of the Fedora KDE packages, has resigned. And he's going to spend more time on Canolo, is it? Which is the pure KDE Fedora remix. And he's described it as easily the worst version they've ever had of Fedora KDE. What is it about KDE people resigning and being kicked out, eh?
But Fedora has a reputation for being GNOME-centric, because as far as I'm concerned, it has a GNOME desktop as the default, if you will. So the KDE is always going to be an alternative to that, default choice. So I'm not surprised that it comes further down the pecking order, and there's maybe not the latest and greatest, and there are more bugs and things involved with fewer resources to fix them. So it makes sense that he'd look for a distribution which has KDE at the forefront if that's what he's interested in. And I think maybe distributions try and have every single desktop environment, but actually just having the one you do well, I think is a more sensible way of going about things. So if they do reduce the effort they're putting into other desktop environments and just concentrate on having a good GNOME user experience, I think it would actually pay off for them.
Yeah, and the impression I got from the reporting about what happened with Kevin is a lot of his woes were down to upstream and the fact that KDE as a project have been refactoring their code and splitting things out into a squillion different little packages as opposed to having just a handful of larger packages. Well, changing tack completely then, this week also brought the sad news that Gene Amdahl had died. Gene worked at IBM and was one of the chief architects of System 360, which could arguably be seen as the world's first truly general-purpose series of computers. And he left IBM to make and sell plug-compatible mainframes, and that kind of foreshadows what the likes of Compaq did in the IBM-compatible PC marketplace. And he's also remembered as the person responsible for using the term FUD, fear, uncertainty and doubt, in the sense that we've come to know and love it in respect to Microsoft. And obviously he was referring to IBM salesmen at the time, but it's passed over into common lingo now.
Yeah, I've not heard about this guy until Paddy put him in the news. And he's died at 92, and it just shows how long computers have been around, that these guys are getting to that sort of age. And the machines that have been working on are, the size of rooms and things. And nowadays we seem to be getting back to that with the sheer size of some of the supercomputers and stuff that, run the internet and run all the services that we use. And that brings on to the next point about the Open HPC collaborative project.
Yeah, according to the most recent top 500 ranking, about 97% of the world's fastest supercomputers actually run Linux these days. And on November the 12th, before the Supercomputer Conference, the Linux Foundation and major players in the industry like Cray, Fujitsu and various universities announced the Open HPC collaborative project. And it's aimed to provide a new open source framework to support high performance computing environments. And Jim Zemlin, the man with many fingers in many pies, said, quote, OpenHPC will provide a neutral forum to develop one open source framework that satisfies a diverse set of cluster environment use cases. Now, HPC market is commonly overlooked, and we do tend to just associate it with universities and the military, for instance. But it's worth about 10 billion a year, and it continues to grow really strongly because of the demands for so-called big data processing.
And this is something that's only going to grow and grow. So I think it's a good thing that we've got this open and collaborative project out there. But you mentioned the spending on this. There's been some research done looking at the amount of money which is spent on technology projects and things like this. And I think it's generally kind of perceived that when you spend lots of money on technology and innovation and things, you must be a booming business and everything must be going well and you will win that money back out of whatever it is you create. But actually this finding is that about 2/3 of what big companies spend on technology either falls short of their expectations and ends up having a poor return on their initial investment. So it's just sort of highlighting that while you might think that Silicon Valley companies that spend lots of money on technology and are innovative and things like this must be pushing the boundaries further forwards and will get that money back, it's not actually always the case. And actually a lot of the money being spent is just on maintaining the status quo, maintaining products they've already made. There's an interesting little quote that sort of made me think was that you spend a lot on technology, now you're sitting on old things. And it's this idea that actually people who spend all the money on the cutting edge, in 2 years' time, that's no longer the cutting edge, and they have to carry on spending money to maintain the old stuff.
Yeah, I thought it was a fascinating report, and it kind of bears out some of the things we bang on about on this show and ties in really nicely with the story about Amdahl. And I mean, mainframes are still going out there and still doing the job that they were originally commissioned to do. And fine, there is a little bit of spend to maintain them going forwards, but a lot of the money people plough into IT these days is just throwaway, and the products they produce are going to be replaced within a year or two, as you say, and new and shiny technologies will come along and some consultant will swan in and convince higher echelons of management that they need to replace with the latest and greatest fad. And I don't know. I mean, it favours everybody in the industry, from the hardware vendors to the software vendors to the consultants, apart from the end consumer who ends up paying for everything.
So moving back to software that's more desktop-centric, and news that Firefox has changed the way they're going to block things in their private browsing mode. So currently private browsing, when you open a new window, only edits and manages your locally stored content like cookies and things like this. But going forwards, they're going to block things that run scripts and try and identify a user. So that would include some adverts and some analytic trackers. And as we were discussing a little while ago on the show, the move to prevent tracking software actually then stops adverts being useful and prevents people from getting funding and things. But it does mean that basically they're trying to do this to, prevent your data getting out to these third parties who might do nefarious things or do number crunching on it. And in effect means that you end up with an ad blocker every time you go to private browsing.
Well, it's either a sign of my naivety or the fact I don't use Firefox. I was actually shocked by this because I just assumed that's what it did in the first place.
No, it's the same on Chrome as well with their incognito window, and it just basically stops someone else locally on your computer finding out what you were looking at. But I think everything that goes out the back end of it is exactly as a normal Chrome browser would be. So, you can use it for buying presents and things.
I've never used either of them, really. It's not something I have ever really needed to use. I mean, I cache to RAM and just have it not save history because I've never really needed history. I've got bookmarks for that. So I've never experienced it. But it seems like quite a good idea. It's almost like private browsing mode is now turning on no script and ad blocker. So it kind of gives you a almost two browsers in one, which I might start using it maybe.
I presume it's not going to be blocking the adverts that Mozilla are serving up.
I wouldn't have thought so.
No, I didn't think so either. Well, sticking on browsers then, and email within browsers, and Brigham Young University have done a follow-up to the famous 15-year-old Why Johnny Can't Encrypt study, and the original one looked at the usability of PGP5, and because technology has moved on a little bit, this time around they decided to focus on the Mailvelope PGP browser extension. And although the sample size was small, I don't really think many people dispute their findings that email crypto is still really user-unfriendly, not only in practice but also in theory. And this really struck me because we missed watching the recording of the live show of Linux Voice at OggCamp because we were recording our Selfish piece at the time, but I listened to it back afterwards. And during that, someone in the audience, because they were talking about privacy, as much OggCamp was talking about privacy this time around, said that it's a solved problem, that crypto, email crypto, is a solved problem, and it's just a case of getting people to adopt it. And what this study is showing is what, anecdotally, we could all say, that it isn't a solved problem, it is still really difficult for people to get their heads around.
Well, I don't think it's necessarily that's the problem, getting your head around it, because the three of us on this show are all perfectly capable of sending encrypted email, but I don't know about you two, I never, ever send anyone any encrypted email. Do you two?
No.
I think the last time I did was some to you when I was sending some passwords for a server, but other than that, no.
Yeah, I mean, it's something that is useful now and again, but it's not something that any of us do as a matter of course. And I'm sure there are some of our listeners who do it as a matter of course, but you can't really do that to normal people, can you? So it's kind of like a double problem, that it's quite complicated and reasonably esoteric insofar as you have to have some technical skill to be able to do it. But even then, if you do have those technical skills, then it's just too much hassle in a multi-device world to do that. And that's why people are moving over to things like Telegram and WhatsApp and, more kind of modern ways to communicate with each other if they're bothered about encryption. I mean, we could spend a long time talking about WhatsApp and potentially even Telegram.
Yeah, I noticed that ISIS claimed responsibility for the attacks in Paris using Telegram.
Yeah, it'll probably be banned before we know it, and I'll lose all my Taylor Swift stickers. But something does need to be done if email crypto is going to become the standard, and I don't think anything is going to be done, and I don't think it is going to become the standard. The standard is going to be things like WhatsApp and Telegram. This is a very old world problem with old world solutions that people who live in the modern age aren't really bothered about.
Yeah, I think you're right to a large degree. I mean, it partly comes down to people's use of devices, doesn't it? I mean, we're used to email on all platforms, but when you talk about mobile, there are alternatives available. But there are also potentially other threats there, aren't there?
Yeah, like new Android adware that's basically impossible to remove without reflashing your phone. And that's people taking apps from supposedly trustworthy sources like Google Play Store and then bundling malware and adware into them and then redistributing them via shady app stores. I remember you were talking about that on the Yola phone, Jesse, where you found these stores that seemed a bit shady. and you were a little bit reluctant.
Yeah, exactly. And what triggered in my head was the fact that I was trying to find an application that was going to store all my passwords. So I was particularly wary about it. And had I been downloading a bus tracker or something, I may not have been so wary. However, this does prove that you need to go through the verified and vetted stores, the Google Play Store basically, in order to get that kind of security. It's when you start going off into the distant woods and you're not really sure what you're downloading but installing it anyway. And this is the problem. And normally when they have routing adware and things like this, you can remove it and carry on with your day as long as you find it. But this one, like you say, you can't remove it from a normal Android install. It's got to be a full-on flash of the phone, take it back to the shop, however you want to do it. But it becomes a lot more ingrained in the device than just the application.
But even if you do download applications from the official stores on iOS or Android, you're still open to all sorts of data leaking out to various third parties.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's an article on Ars Technica where researchers analysed 55 applications on Google from the Android store and 55 from the Apple store, the 55 most popular. And they found that half of all of those sent users' names, about a third of them sent GPS coordinates and things, and then a quarter sent email addresses and IMEI numbers and things like this, because they're all sending information back to either the people who are making the application or, in a lot of instances, third parties, adverts, things like this. So your information is leaking out the back of your phone, whether you've got properly installed, Google Play supported applications, or if you've gone to some other app store.
So do you think this is a potential selling point for things like the Ubuntu phone, and they really should be playing up on the privacy angle?
I hadn't thought about that, but yeah, they should play up on that. I mean, being totally open source, they can show exactly what it's doing rather than all the horrible proprietary stuff in the other mobile platforms. Yeah, I mean, they seem to be focusing on the convergence and the practicalities of it, but I know that a lot of people are concerned about privacy. So yeah, maybe they should do that.
I suppose there's a fine line to tread with the looking like a bit of a tinfoil hat type phone, or the normal person in the street, in air quotes, not really understanding that it's a normal phone and this is a benefit of it, rather than being sold as a firmly as that is the main reason to get it. Which we understand, but if you're twisting your PR sort of machine to be it's safe and secure, that might be the only message that comes across. But I haven't heard anything down that line from the Ubuntu phone people, and it is a drum they should at least beat a little bit.
Yeah, well, it's been an interesting couple of weeks for security news, and one of the biggest stories out there was an article in the Washington Post that was kind of laying into Linux and Linus a little bit.
Now, you posted this on Google Plus, Paddy, and I criticised it quite heavily because it seems to be quite badly researched, and there are quite a lot of errors and, just false information. But you replied to me saying that although there were those errors, that the fundamentals and the fundamental points that article was talking about actually do ring true.
Yeah, I mean, it's not a case of ringing true. It's just straight quotes from Linus. It is his attitude that a bug is a bug and a security bug is the same as any other sort of bug. And this article got really slated by a lot of people in the FOSS world, and I think that is kind of very short-sighted.
Well, I think it's easy to slate something that's badly researched and written. I mean, if it had been written properly, then it would have been taken more seriously.
Yeah, I can accept that, but I contrast it with how there was reporting on the recent aspersions cast by Sarah Sharp, for instance, and people were very happy to get behind Linus this time and say, no, there's nothing wrong with the kernel, although there are arguments that technically things could be done a lot more securely, whereas in the Sarah Sharp side of things, no one's prepared to stand up and say, this is okay what is going on here. So I don't know, I found it very strange that in one case you've got a very strong reaction from a large group of people, but it was purely emotionally based, not factual at all. Whereas in this case, where there are facts, there are definite technical discussions we could be having, people are refusing to actually engage.
Well, another article you posted on Google Plus this week was written by Eric Raymond, talking about social justice warriors and the concept that to them a meritocracy is a bad thing, and that you should prioritize equality of minorities over the quality of code. And it does make you think that, is that really the situation? Are people really so obsessed, I suppose is the word, with social justice that, code will actually suffer and we will get worse software as a result of it?
Yeah, it's got to be a good thing to remove hurdles for people getting involved and making sure there's a sensible range of people and that there's no group who is more accepted than others. But if you've got two people and one of them is better at writing code, that should be all the question is, not let's make sure there is a third black, a third white, a third Asian, or whatever it is, and force that to happen and then get some code out of it. It does seem very, very backwards and not at all what, Linux and open source is set up to do.
Yeah, it'd be good if we could stay focused on the technical issues and trying to make the best product possible, although some people will cringe at the word product here, but that's what we're talking about. Which is why I was disappointed with the reaction that article from the Washington Post got, because people were just too readily jumping up and saying it's all Microsoft FUD, and because of the errors in the article, dismissing the entirety of it, rather than thinking, yeah, there's a kernel of truth here, if you excuse the pun, based entirely on what Linus has said himself in the past and exactly how he behaves. And we really ought to potentially taking a little bit more interest in the security of the kernel. I mean, you think about Internet of Things, which I know has been a buzzword for a long time, but is becoming reality. And a Gartner report I saw recently suggests there's going to be something like 6 billion of those within the next couple of years floating about out there. And a lot of these things are going to be a kernel plus an application, possibly compiled together, so it's one of these sort of unikernel type jobs. If the security on that isn't as best as it can be out of the box, I mean, very few of these are going to get updates. We really ought to be massively concerned about the state of kernel security and how we're shipping things.
Well, there are some people trying to take steps to deal with this stuff, including Case Cook.
Yeah, Case has been one of those people that's been critical of how Linus has been doing things for quite a while now. And he works at Google on Chrome OS security, and he knows what he's talking about. And he put a post up on kernel hardening on OpenWall and said, I'm organising a community of people to work on the various kernel self-protection technologies, most of which we found in PAX and GR security. I'm building on the presentation I gave at the Kernel Summit, where I sought to convince the other upstream Linux kernel developers that security is more than fixing bugs and that we need to bring in proactive defences. And he carried on, between the companies that recognise the critical nature of this work and with the Linux Foundation's Core Infrastructure Initiative happy to start funding specific work in this area, I think we can really make a dent. So various groups are being formed and people are starting to do work, whether or not there is expectation of it being accepted upstream in the kernel. And I think it's a good thing for the reasons I've spelled out already, particularly considering the Internet of Things, where updates simply aren't going to happen in a lot of cases and vendors are going to shove out a box as cheaply as possible, and that'll be the end of the story.
Well, hopefully these things will get accepted and we will tighten up security in the kernel. But that'll do it for the news then. Let's move on to Over a Pint.
So as everyone listening will be well aware, we've recently attended OggCamp up in Liverpool. And the whole experience got me thinking about how free and open source events are actually staged. And I know sometimes we can come across a little negative on this show, but it is an attempt at constructive criticism. I had some thoughts about events like OggCamp, and I just wanted to explore the topic a little bit with you two guys and see if we could come up with the recipe for a perfect free and open source event. Shall we kick off with what was good about OggCamp this year?
Yeah, okay. What was good for me was the social side of things, and that's what I always say, that it's almost not even as important, the event itself. It's more the social stuff that orbits around that. And, getting a chance to go for a drink with people who I hadn't seen for ages and kind of forming new friendships and meeting up with listeners and stuff. So for me, that was the what was really good about it. And I know that's sort of not really what you're asking, is it? You're trying to talk about the main event itself. But I think what I'm trying to say is that it's very important to make the social aspect of it good, or try and make that good, try and organize that well, because it's equally as important as the event itself.
Yeah, and I'd agree with you. And I found that really beneficial, enjoyed it thoroughly. It is one of the aspects, though, I think that could potentially be enhanced. I mean, one of the things with an event like OggCamp is it's in a city that nobody lives in, or very few of us live in. So we're all travelling and we're all staying in different hotels and such like. And fine, you meet up in bars and what have you, but you're not all lumped together. And that makes that aspect of it slightly more difficult. I mean, there were organised events for us to attend on the evenings for drinking and eating and what have you, but people did tend to clump together, and also some folks went to different events. So would it not be possible, do you think, to have an environment where people are thrown more together for 2 or 3 days, and wouldn't that be beneficial?
Well, in 2012, there was an official hotel, which was just up the road from the venue. And so most people were staying in that hotel. So that made it easier. And also the social event on the Saturday night was in the hotel in a kind of function room. So that meant that there was more of a centralized party and feeling to it. And again, in Farnham, when that was in 2011, this party was in the same venue as the main event itself. So I think that that is a good idea, to try and centralize things so that people find it easier to stick together, and you don't have this fracturing. I mean, we on the Saturday night at OggCamp went for a quick pint that ended up being 3 or 4 pints, and then we managed to somehow get everyone to come to us, which was really cool. But there was kind of a fracturing there, and I think you're right. The more centralized it is, the better.
Yeah, last year's event was held at a hotel, and I know some people stayed at that hotel, but it was quite an expensive one, and it definitely put us off, so we stayed a little bit further away. And the idea of having a blessed kind of location to stay at would be a good one, but you then can't really book out the entire place. I think perhaps the weekend that was chosen for this OggCamp was a difficult one because it was Halloween, and Liverpool's a very popular place, very vibrant and cultural, so lots of bars. So it's bound to be busy over Halloween, and therefore I think we had a bit of a trouble getting hotels and things. So perhaps a different weekend would have improved things, and you could have maybe block booked or said that this one particular hotel is the place that we're going to stay. I'm just not sure how possible that is if you're not holding the event at a hotel. And that sort of comes back to my thought on the whole OggCamp experience, and that is location, location, location. I preferred this location to the previous one, ignoring the actual city it is in and getting there and staying, all these sorts of things, just where OggCamp was being held and the facilities on site, as it were. So last year, as I said, it was at a hotel, and they did have one big room for the sort of intro and outro things, but it was a flat floor. And so actually, when you get everyone in there for things like the raffle or the welcome and goodbye events, it was a bit difficult to sort of see what was going on because there's all these other people there. And then they had other rooms that seemed to be down a number of distant corridors and things, and you spent a bit of time wandering from one to the other and, potentially missing out on the start of the one you wanted to go and see. Whereas this year's one in Liverpool was at a university, and so they had a tiered seating for the main auditorium, which is absolutely fantastic. And then all the rooms were a lot closer, and so you could quickly jump from one to the other, and you didn't waste any time wandering around. They also had the main exhibition space sort of in between the main auditorium and the rest of the room, so you're forced to walk through it, and it made it much more of a sort of conversational area, whereas last year the exhibition space was off to one side, which I've heard some people say they thought it was better, but from my opinion, I felt it was a little bit sort of isolated and stagnant from that point of view.
Yeah, I've definitely got to agree on that score. I thought it was much better, the exhibition space this time around. But just taking it back to the location, I was trying to think in my head how you could do this to actually acquire that amount of accommodation and presentation space for like 2 or 3 days, which we're talking about. And I was wondering whether something like Butlins wouldn't actually be a good idea.
Wow, there's a word I haven't heard for a while. Yeah, that's not a terrible idea, but isn't that busy most of the year round? I don't know, it's been years. I was a little kid and I went there once, I think.
Yeah, I think this time of year, out of season, it's reasonably quiet and they're happy to accommodate large groups. I mean, I was talking to a friend of mine who was at Butland's Skegness a couple of days back, and they were there for an 80s party weekend, and basically they just rent out the whole village as it would be and put on this concert, and it's people of like mind can pole up and obviously attend it. And it just strikes me that that sort of environment where you all push together and you've got facilities on site would potentially be better than us being spread around in different hotels around a large city.
Yeah, I had a very similar thought, but for universities. So I went to university in Guildford, and it's a campus university. So there isn't a wall, obviously, but effectively you could draw a wall around it, and then you've got all of the university facilities, and then clumps of housing within the university. So there is the sort of posher end that has en suites and things like this, and there's maybe only 6 rooms to a kitchen, and then you've got the less expensive end where you have sort of shared bathrooms and bigger numbers of people per kitchen and things like this. But that means that you have a tiered pricing, and if you could just say, right, we're going to need these 5 rooms, this space for the weekend, and we would like this entire accommodation block, which, holds 200 pupils, and during the summer holiday when they've all moved out is empty. That sort of thing, I think, is an alternative to Butland's, but along the same lines where you're, I don't want to say trapped in one place, but, all kept in one place. There's that sort of sense of community.
Okay, so that's kind of the location covered. What about the actual content? I mean, there were a few pre-booked speakers this time, but I mean, would it be an idea to have the main track totally booked and then the other tracks to be on conference?
I think that's a good idea. I think we're going to have to talk about it. If I could just pause for one moment on the way that this OggCamp started, and it is, I think, the single biggest negative I would put on this OggCamp, and that is that we had the welcome introduction, and this is how it's going to run, and this is where the facilities are, and just sort of a general overview of what was going to happen on the weekend. Fantastic. They then, without any option of choosing or anything, had the first speaker start, which, if it was sort of a keynote type speaker on something very core to the reason that people are at OggCamp, maybe Mark Shuttleworth as a name out of the hat, that sort of thing, I think everyone would listen and want to hear what was going on. But the first speaker they brought out was talking about things on the solar system and space type area of things. And I wasn't really sure who he was, what he was talking about, what was going on. I have to admit, I felt that I should have had the choice as to whether I wanted to attend that, not this is happening because you're already sat in the room. And I actually excused myself halfway through because I wasn't really impressed with the speaker. So in my opinion, if OggCamp was to have key speakers in the main hall pre-planned and pre-advertised for the weekend, there should definitely be a gap between the welcome introduction and the first speaker. But going back to your point, I think it is a good idea if you had people already booked out for the main space.
Yeah, I think it'd be really beneficial to have a fully booked main track, if you like. I too wasn't particularly enamoured with the first presentation and felt somewhat guilty about getting up and walking out before both of you, actually. So it would help a great deal. And I think it would also help attract people if they had some feeling for what was going to be there. And the unconference stuff is great, and being able to be exposed to things you're not expecting is really interesting. But as a draw, having a main track preordained, I think, is a good idea.
Yeah, especially if you can get some big names, and then people would potentially go to the event just because there's that one name who they know is a good speaker, has some interesting stuff to say, and then they can discover all of the other stuff through the unconference. But yeah, I think that it would be a good idea to do that.
Both times that I've been to OggCamp, I was not convinced the unconference thing would work. I just didn't feel that people would come along and put their names in the hat and see if they could do their presentation and how do you know you had enough rooms and all these sorts of things. But both times I've been very pleasantly surprised that it actually worked out really well. Everyone who I think put their name forward to do a talk got a space and had a sensible number of people attending. So I think that's now put that fear of mine to bed that the unconference thing is an odd way of doing it. I think it works really, really well. Maybe for someone who's not been to one before or who isn't aware of the way in which it works, it would be odd to go to an event that you don't know anyone who's speaking and you don't know what the topics will be. You just sort of have to hope that they're relevant or interesting. And, I have to say, more often than not, I miss out on seeing things I want to see because they're clashing with things I'm already planning on seeing, rather than, trying to find something which I might find interesting. So the unconference thing, I think, is a great way of going about it.
I often find that there'll be at least two things that you want to see happening at the same time. And so I wonder, is there a huge benefit to recording them, having them all videoed, which has happened in the past but didn't really happen this time? Are you ever really going to go back and watch those presentations, or is it a kind of live for the moment thing and, enjoy the moment rather than trying to capture it?
Well, to answer that directly, yes, I would want to watch one. There was one that Laura did, which had a lot of people discussing it afterwards, and still on social media, people are sort of talking about it and saying thank you for talking about that. Now, it was on at the same time as, I think, a ZFS discussion, which I wanted to go and see. And so I had to miss one. So I think if they were all recorded, and I understand that saying it is a lot easier than doing it and putting it into practice,
yeah,
it would be a very useful thing to have.
And I suppose it's a good advert as well, isn't it? If you can put all of the talks up on YouTube or something similar, then people can say, okay, this happened last year, so it'll hopefully be equally as good next year.
Yeah, absolutely. But just taking it back to Laura's talk for a minute, I mean, that wasn't about technology, whereas vast majority of the talks were very clearly about technology. And that kind of feeds into the feeling I got. Well, it wasn't really a feeling, it was just a fact. It was a much less diverse crowd this year than it was last year.
Yeah, I wonder why that was. I mean, it did seem to be just pretty much middle-aged white blokes like us. Or, well, maybe middle-aged is the wrong word, but,
Yeah, okay. Stop twisting the knife.
But yeah, I don't know why that was. It's a bit of a curious one.
Yeah, and again, trying to be constructive, I wonder if there's an opportunity here. OggCamp described itself and tried to sell itself as the UK's largest free and open culture event. And there was precious little about open culture there. I would have thought there'd be the opportunity there to change the event somewhat, to actually bring in a different crowd, so it isn't just old white men.
So for my benefit, Paddy, and I assume therefore for a listener or two, what would you define as sort of open culture?
Well, far more than just code, which is predominantly, bar what Laura did, was what the entire unconference was. It was all about code and about protocols and computers. There was someone demonstrating a knitting machine there that was largely 3D printed, but there wasn't a whole heap of culture there. And for an event that claimed to be a free culture event, I mean, think about the arts. There was nothing to do with the arts there as far as I could tell. There was no Creative Commons music artists there. And surely if you had things like that at an event like that, you'd bring in a totally different crowd, and there'd be the opportunity for that crowd to mingle with the Linux crowd and vice versa, and we'd all benefit and we'd all get something out of it.
Well, that has happened in the past. There have been Creative Commons musicians there. But yeah, I think that this time there was a much stronger focus on the computer side of things. So yeah, I suppose booking, that goes back to the booking of guests, doesn't it? If you had on the main track some people talking about computer stuff, but then potentially musicians talking about, the challenges they've faced with Creative Commons and trying to make money and stuff, that could potentially make it more diverse, yeah.
Yeah, I'm not even talking about musicians talking about their issues. I'm talking about musicians playing.
Yeah, well, I mean, that is a pretty big challenge to put on live music. I mean, speakers are quite easy. All you need is a projector and a microphone, but when you're trying to have a band and you've got noise issues, but yeah, potentially as part of the overall event, I mean, maybe in the evenings. I mean, that has traditionally happened before, that there's been some sort of gig and it's mostly been Creative Commons musicians doing it. I mean, I know I've played at a couple of those things and all my stuff's always Creative Commons, and Dan and his band have played before. So yeah, I think that is a good idea to have that. And, in the future events, I mean, even if it's not just OggCamp, maybe that would be a good idea to have some musical aspect to it. But I feel that we've kind of, we were trying to be constructive with this discussion, and I feel that we've been a little bit negative and a little bit harsh on OggCamp. I mean, it is still a really good event, and I'm really glad that I went. And I know how difficult. I mean, well, I say I know how difficult it must be to organise. I don't know because I've never done it. It must be harder than I assume, and I assume it to be very hard. So you've got to give props to Dan and Les and everyone else who organised it.
Yeah, absolutely, very much. I certainly don't want this to come across as just bare criticism. It's meant as constructive criticism. I thoroughly enjoyed the event. I fully intend to attend again. I just think we could appeal to a wider audience, if you like, and that could only be a good thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we're having this discussion in order to improve on something that we want to see get better rather than just being purely negative. And as you say, we're bound to go next year. It was great fun both this year and last. And unfortunately, some of the key people from organising it this year and previous years, as you just mentioned, Joe, Dan and Les, are unlikely to be able to put forward their time and effort this year. So it looks like there'll be a slightly different crowd organising it, and we'll have to see what comes about from that. And maybe they can listen to this and get some ideas.
You never know. So with that then, we're coming to the end of another Linux Luddites. You can email us, show@linuxluddites.com, find us on Twitter or Google Plus or the Facebook communities, or leave a comment on the website. Thanks for joining me, Paddy and Jesse, and thanks to everyone for listening. We'll see you again next week for more Linux news, reviews, comment, and generally being grumpy.
Goodbye, everybody.
Goodbye.
See you later.